Chapter 20. Privy Wars. "I have had Mabel remove all chamber pots from the household," Mrs. Brocket announced to her husband one morning, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested this declaration warranted immediate praise. Mr. Brocket peered over his newspaper. "Indeed! And what, pray tell, are we to use instead?" "I have had Mabel install a water closet upstairs, her second attempt. It is most modern. Lady Uppington mentioned that only the most fashionable houses in London have them." "Mabel!" Mr. Brocket's eyebrows rose incrementally. "Our Mabel? The same Mabel who managed to set fire to water while attempting to boil eggs?" "She has assured me she is quite capable," Mrs. Brocket said, though her expression suggested Mabel had done nothing of the sort. "I gave her detailed instructions." "Which were?" "To make it work, naturally. Really, Henry, must you question everything?" Mr. Brocket returned to his newspaper with a slight shake of his head. "I merely wonder if entrusting complex plumbing work to our maid again might lead to unfortunate consequences. It springs to mind that evening during dinner when our potential son-in-law was treated to an unexpected shower of "We need not revisit the specifics," Mrs. Brocket cut in sharply. "Suffice to say, the second attempt has been most efficacious." From somewhere above came an ominous gurgling sound, followed by Mabel's voice. "I ain't promising nothing about this contraption, mind. Could go any minute, it could." Mrs. Brocket's lips compressed into a thin line. "Mabel, less commentary and more dusting." "Can't dust right now, Mum. Got me horrible constipation again." "Again? That's the third time today." "Right nasty it is. Might be stuck here for hours." Several days passed in this fashion, with Mabel's claimed digestive ailments growing ever more frequent and prolonged. She had taken to spending entire days ensconced in the Privy, emerging only for meals and sleep. "This cannot continue," Mrs. Brocket declared one morning, pacing the drawing room while Isabella lounged on the sofa, projecting studied indifference. "The girl is clearly malingering." "Perhaps she truly is unwell," Marianne offered brightly. "Like that time our cow ate father's treatise on philosophy and couldn't produce milk for a week, though the milk it did eventually give tasted remarkably intellectual." Mrs. Brocket ignored her middle daughter's contribution. "We must devise a strategy to flush her out, as it were." "Mother, your metaphors are becoming distressingly literal," Isabella drawled. "I have conceived a plan of utmost cleverness," Mrs. Brocket continued, her eyes gleaming with the particular light that usually preceded domestic disaster. "We shall create a blockage in the pipes, forcing her to abandon her sanctuary when she can no longer flush." Isabella's pose of studied indifference cracked slightly. "And how exactly do you propose to accomplish this?" "I have already instructed the gardener to deposit several shovelfuls of earth down the external pipe." "Surely that cannot possibly," Isabella began, but was interrupted by a tremendous gurgling from above, followed by a series of increasingly alarming sounds suggesting liquid under pressure, seeking alternative exits. "Mrs. Brocket!" Mabel's voice screeched from upstairs, a door slamming open and footsteps hurrying. "Help! Emergency! There's muck coming up through every crack in the floor." Mrs. Brocket ascended the stairs with what she clearly intended to be dignified haste, only to halt abruptly at the sight of dark liquid seeping under the privy door and creating elaborate patterns on the landing carpet. "Well," she said, drawing herself up to her full height, "how unfortunate that must have been for you." "Unfortunate?" Mabel's voice dripped with as much sarcasm as the ceiling below. "That's a right funny way of putting it. Let me guess. You've turned the whole upstairs into a bleedin' river of sh. That will do, Mabel, for it will be you who will clean this up. Immediately. Oh, will I now? And how am I supposed to do that when I'm suffering from this awful constipation? Your constipation appears to have now miraculously resolved itself, given the volume of your complaints and your elusive appearance outside of the Privy. Funny how stress messes with the bowels, ain't it? Mabel replied. But I suppose I could start cleaning. Might take me all day, mind. Maybe tomorrow too. Shame about all them other chores. What ain't gonna get done? Mrs. Brocket's face contorted through several expressions before settling on one of grim determination. Very well. But this is not the end of the matter. No, ma'am, Mabel agreed. I expect it's just the beginning of a right mess. As Mrs. Brocket descended the stairs with as much dignity as one can muster while avoiding puddles of questionable providence, she was already forming new plans. The battle for control of the Privy had only just begun. Mrs. Brocket's next stratagem came to her during a particularly vexing afternoon of listening to Mabel's theatrical groans emanating from above. She summoned Isabella to her parlour with an air of conspiratorial triumph. I have devised the perfect solution, she announced, producing a pot of paste from behind a cushion. We shall simply adhere all the Privy paper together. When nature genuinely calls, she'll be forced to emerge in search of fresh supplies. Isabella languidly inspected the fringe of her shawl. And you don't think she might notice this tampering beforehand? We shall execute the plan tonight while she sleeps, Mrs. Brocket declared, already savouring her imminent victory. I have observed that Mabel sleeps like the dead after consuming her evening gin. That night, mother and daughter crept up the stairs like a pair of remarkably well-dressed burglars. Mrs. Brocket clutched the paste pot while Isabella carried several sheets of writing paper, the household's designated privy supply having mysteriously vanished during one of Mabel's marathon sessions. Really, Mother, Isabella whispered as they worked by candlelight. Don't you think this rather beneath our dignity? Dignity? Mrs. Brocket hissed back, liberally applying paste. Dignity is precisely what we are fighting to restore. No respectable household should be held hostage by its maids' claimed bowel movements. Their task complete, they retreated downstairs, Mrs. Brocket practically vibrating with anticipation of the morning's triumph. The next afternoon, as Mrs. Brocket was explaining to Marianne why her suggestion of training squirrels to deliver messages was impractical, a sharp rap at the door announced Lady Uppington's arrival. My dear Mrs. Brocket, Lady Uppington swept in, her elaborate bonnet quivering with barely contained gossip. I simply had to call. I've just heard the most fascinating rumour about the Worthingtons' new footman. Mrs. Brocket ushered her esteemed guest into the drawing-room, mentally calculating how many cups of tea would be required to extract every detail. Mabel, she called, tea service at once. A distant voice floated down. Sorry, ma'am. Terrible constipation again. Mrs. Brocket's smile became rather fixed. You must excuse our maid's indisposition. On this one occasion, I shall prepare the tea myself. How very democratic of you, Lady Uppington remarked, her tone suggesting this was not entirely a compliment. The tea had just been poured when Lady Uppington shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I wonder, might I impose upon your facilities? Mrs. Brocket brightened considerably. This was her chance to demonstrate their fashionable new water closet, and perhaps finally extract Mabel in the process. Of course, up the stairs, first door on the right. Mabel, vacate the Privy at once. We have a guest. A shuffling sound preceded Mabel's emergence. She trudged down the stairs, shooting Mrs. Brocket a look that promised future retribution. Lady Uppington ascended with all the dignity her position demanded. Mrs. Brocket settled back, anticipating both choice gossip and Mabel's imminent return to regular duties. Several minutes passed. Then came a sound that would haunt Mrs. Brocket's dreams for weeks to come. Lady Uppington's voice, pitched several octaves higher than usual, with an edge that could have cut diamond. "Mrs. Brocket, what is the meaning of this outrage?" Mrs. Brocket found Lady Uppington on the landing, her face nearly as purple as her dress, clutching several sheets of thoroughly pasted paper. "I have never," Lady Uppington declared, each word falling like an icicle, "in all my years of social calls, encountered such an assault upon a guest's person and dignity." "My dear Lady Uppington, I can explain." "Explain? Explain? How does one explain deliberate sabotage of the most essential of papers? Is this some sort of demented jest?" "It was meant for Mabel," Mrs. Brocket blurted, immediately realising this was perhaps not the most diplomatic response. "Oh, so you regularly torment your servants in this fashion? How very progressive of you." Lady Uppington's voice could have frozen flame. "I believe I shall take my leave, and my tales of the Worthingtons' footman with me." She swept down the stairs and out the front door with remarkable speed for one in her predicament. From the kitchen came the sound of Mabel's distinctive cackle. Mrs. Brocket stood motionless on the landing, her carefully laid plans lying in ruins around her feet. Along with, she noticed with horror, several drops of paste that had somehow transferred from the paper to Lady Uppington's expensive silk dress. "Well," came Isabella's drawl from behind her, "I suppose we can strike Lady Uppington from our social calendar. Though I must say, Mother, your campaign to elevate our standing in society is proving remarkably effective. In reverse." Mrs. Brocket's only response was a sound somewhere between a growl and a whimper. From above came the familiar creak of the privy door, followed by Mabel's cheerful voice. "Corblimey, what a relief! Think I'm feeling loads better now. Though I might need another few hours, just to be sure, like—" Mrs. Brocket's third attempt at reclaiming her household's dignity arrived in the form of Constable Hawkins, who appeared at the front door one morning to investigate reports of suspicious noises from the Brocket estate. "Merely our maid's digestive complaints," Mrs. Brocket assured him, noting with interest how the constable shifted from foot to foot. "Though perhaps you'd care for some refreshment. The morning is rather warm." 3 glasses of ale later, Constable Hawkins was practically dancing in place. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but might I make use of your facilities?" Mrs. Brocket's eyes gleamed. "Of course, though I should mention our maid has taken up permanent residence within. Mabel," she called upstairs, "the law requires immediate entry." "Law can wait its turn like anyone else," came the reply. "Nature's got priority." "Now see here," Constable Hawkins called up, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, somewhat undermined by his obvious desperation. "This is a matter of public order. Open this door at once." A pause followed, then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door creaked open just enough for Mabel's face to appear. "Well, if you're gonna be all official about it." She never finished her sentence. Constable Hawkins had already shouldered past her into the privy, slamming the door behind him. Mrs. Brocket waited expectantly for Mabel's ejection. Minutes ticked by. "I say," came the constable's voice, notably softer than before. "This is a rather cosy little room, isn't it?" "Ain't it just?" Mabel's voice replied from within. "Bodged it together myself, I did." "I've always admired a woman with practical skills." "Well, that's me. Right clever with me hands, I am. Should oo seen the way I once fixed up the chimney, till that caved in. Mrs. Brocket listened in mounting horror as the conversation between the pair within grew increasingly familiar. When she heard Mabel giggle, she knew decisive action was required. "Isabella!" she hissed to her daughter, who had been watching proceedings with undisguised amusement. "Go outside and fetch me the longest rope you can find from the shed." "Mother, I'm not sure where you think this is going, but—" "The rope, Isabella! Now!" Minutes later, Mrs. Brocket stood admiring her solution, with one end of a reluctant rope tied firmly to the upstairs privy door handle and bolts, and the other end several rooms away and disappearing out of a window attached to their two most spirited horses. "This seems ill-advised," Mr. Brocket observed, passing by with a frown. "Desperate times, Henry!" Mrs. Brocket replied, gathering her skirts. "Now, Isabella, when I give the signal—" "Oh, look!" Marianne interrupted brightly. "The constable's teaching Mabel a new song, though I'm not sure why they need to breathe so heavily while singing it." Mrs. Brocket's face set like granite. "Now, Isabella!" she shouted out loud. "Start the horses!" Isabella, who had been waiting for just such a catastrophe, slapped the horses' flanks with perhaps more enthusiasm than strictly necessary. The animals began bolting forward. What followed would be discussed in Lesser Mudbury for long enough after. The rope went taut. The privy door held for approximately 3 seconds before the entire structure, with an almighty crack, tore free from its moorings. The wooden closet, with its occupants still inside, crashed through several of the upper floor's walls and continued its wrenching in a perfect arc through the air before landing with a tremendous splash in the ornamental pond 50 feet outside. From the wreckage first emerged Constable Hawkins, his uniform dripping and his dignity entirely absent, followed by a sodden, grumpy-faced Mabel. "This," the constable spluttered, "this is a clear case of assault upon an officer of the law, and criminal damage, and—" he paused. "I shall be noting this incident in my report." "Noting what incident?" Mabel asked innocently, wringing out her apron. "You and your poor workmanship." The constable adjusted what remained of his uniform. "Whole thing just fell apart, didn't it? Barely fit for one person to relieve themselves in, let alone two. Whatever were you thinking?" Her plans of any future romantic acquaintance with the constable vanishing faster than a rat up a drainpipe, Mabel shot Mrs. Brocket a glare. "Shame about the installing. Almost like someone didn't want to pay for proper materials, time, and someone who knows what they're doing." Mrs. Brocket, who had watched this exchange with increasing apoplexy, finally found her voice. "There is no good waving a finger at me, Mabel. You can consider this mess docked from your wages, whatever they are now since the last docking." Constable Hawkins, not wishing to be caught further between a scowling matriarch and her maid, coughed awkwardly. Yes, well, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to. Most notably finding some clean, dry clothes and a set of bandages. And I hope that's enough of my investigations here for quite some time. Good day to you all." He squelched away with what little dignity he could muster as Mrs. Brocket surveyed the scene. The gaping hole in her house, the splintered remains of the privy floating in her pond, and Mabel, dripping and bedraggled, looking around for a new place to hide. "I suppose," Mrs. Brocket said through gritted teeth, "we shall have to return to using chamber pots. Mabel, fetch them at once, from wherever I told you to hide them. Nowhere too creative, I hope. I did say the kitchen was out of bounds." Mabel's eyes averted Mrs. Brocket's gaze as she recollected where at least 2 had been shelved, before squelching her own way back towards the house in approximately the direction of the kitchen. Mrs. Brocket was left to contemplate how a simple matter of household plumbing had led to such complete and utter defeat. "Well," Isabella drawled, "at least we can be certain Mabel won't be hiding in the Privy any more." Mrs. Brocket's only response was to stare balefully at the pond, where pieces of her modernisation attempt continued to bob mockingly on the surface, much like her hopes for social elevation.